Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tippy, and I'll be your host once again for today's episode. I've got a case study for you today. This is on a little bit of an older one, but it was pretty interesting. It was a 99 Volvo S70. This thing's got a 2.3 liter turbo engine. Actually has tabs on it from 2017, so I guess it hasn't been driven in a long time. It was grandma's car or something, and they're trying to get this thing back on the road. It's been at this shop for quite some time trying to get it running. And what I was originally called in for on this one was just to clone over a module or program a module is what they wanted. So they were replacing the ECM on this Volvo with a used ECM that they had gotten from a junkyard, and they weren't able to find a new one. I didn't do any searching to see if a new one was available, but they said, we got a used one. Can you program it? Now, I don't have the factory Volvo set up, nor do I know does the current version of that support something all the way back to 99. I don't get a ton of calls on Volvo, so I haven't gotten, I think Vita is the name of the factory tooling, or at least the software to do it. I've heard it's a real big pain in the ass to get set up and expensive, which doesn't necessarily mean that's a thing that should stop me. I just haven't had enough demand to get it. So, and I also don't know whether it would do a used module or not. You know, there's a possibility that it may not support a used module programming. And on something this old, again, I just don't know. So the route that I decided to go here was to see, can I just clone over the original module to this donor module? That might be the easiest way for me to do it if my tooling supports it. So I look, and Flex, it's made by Magic Motorsports, an ECM and TCM cloning device. It does support this ECM that's in this Volvo. And you can look at the service number on the back. It's a Bosch module, and you can go to Bosch's website and type in this service number. It tells you the model, which is an ME 7.0 on this particular vehicle. And then it'll show you, okay, this Flex covers this one. And it did. So I said, okay, we'll give it a shot. We'll clone it over and see what happens. So I grab both modules from the shop. I bring them to my house. I clone one from the other, take the original flash and EEPROM, and I put it into this donor module that they got from the junkyard. After that, it's pretty straightforward and easy. Copy, paste, right? You look at the color diagrams, put the wires where they go, copy, paste, you're done. I bring the modules back to the shop and say, here you go, it's cloned over, plug it in and see what happens. Okay. And they didn't do it right away when I dropped them off. I moved on to my next appointment, and I got a call later that day from the shop, and they said, hey, we plugged that module in and we have the same issue as before. I said, okay, cool. What would you like me to do about that? So they're telling me that, they had diagnosed this as an ECM. And what was going on with it was that if you did a battery disconnect, like take the cables off the battery, touch them together, capacitive discharge, and then reconnect them, you could start up this vehicle. It would crank, it would start, and it would run all day long if you let it. You could go drive around town, no issues, until you turn the key off, until you gave it a key cycle. Once you gave this vehicle a key cycle, which is off to on, after that initial battery reconnect, it would crank, but it wouldn't start. And from what the shop had determined is that the ECM was basically offline. And what they were pointing to indicate this was, hey, we have a check engine light on that first key cycle after we connect the battery. And then afterwards, there is no check engine light, right? And when we turn the key on, there should be a bulb test. You should see a check engine light on most cars. This one, it definitely should once you key it up. And you do until that first key cycle, and then it's gone, and it just cranks. And they said they couldn't communicate with the ECM at this point, but they were having troubles communicating with it at all. But they had gone through the steps. They had checked the circuits that they decided were necessary for this thing to power up, said everything was fine. It's got to be in the computer. Okay. So again, I'm back to, okay, all I've done is clone a module. Do you want me to get into this as a diagnosis? And they said, yeah, why don't you come down here and diagnose this for us, see what you think, because, you know, I told them it's pretty unlikely that this used module had the exact same problem as what you're dealing with. There's probably something else going on in the car, but I got to look at it to figure that out. So I go and I verify that this is exactly what's going on, and it is every single time. It does exactly what they said it did. It will start and run after a battery disconnect, but you cycle that key and then you get nothing. So I'm going to jump into this diagnosis here and try to figure out what's going on. And I immediately find right away that I'm having trouble communicating with the vehicle. Now, the way this is set up is your scan tool plugs in the DLC. Okay, yeah, like most cars. And then the DLC, which is actually in the center console on this one, if you're looking for one of these old Volvos, the DLC has a diagnostic can that's going to go to the cluster or the gateway. The DLC is actually also connected to the K line. The K line would be just a single wire communication. This is lower speed. But one of the things that's on there is the immobilizer on the K line. And the rest of the car, or the rest of the modules I'm interested in talking to at this point, maybe I should say, like the ECM, the TCM, the ABS, this is all on the high-speed CAN or CAN bus, even though it's a 99, but it's on the other side of the cluster or gateway, if you will. So what I mean by that is when you're plugged in the DLC, you don't have a direct shot to the CAN bus where the modules are actually communicating on the vehicle. The cluster is exactly what I said it was. It's a gateway, it's a buffer between you and the rest of the vehicle. So when I'm trying to talk to the ECM, for instance, that's one I'm interested in here, I have to go through the cluster in order to do it. All right. And I can't talk to it. And I actually can't talk to anything on the CAN bus. And I tried my auto and I tried my top down, and it gave me the same result. Basically, I couldn't talk to anything on that high-speed CAN or the CAN bus for the vehicle. And I even tried, a battery disconnect, and it was the same thing. That initial start where I could start the vehicle, the check engine lights on, I couldn't talk to anything. And that includes the cluster as well. I wasn't able to communicate with the cluster, but I could talk to stuff on the K line. And there actually was a direct shot between the scan tool and the K line, which is the immobilizer. The immobilizer had a code in it for no comm with the ECM. And that makes sense why, okay, we're not able to start this thing if the immobilizer can't talk to the ECM. So now I'm thinking, okay, there's some sort of data transfer issue between our cluster and these two networks, right? Because the cluster is going to be transferring data from one network to another in order for this thing to operate properly. And based on what I'm seeing with my scan tool, okay, there is an issue with communication here. So how do I proceed with this? What I decided to do was go to the connector on the cluster, which isn't the easiest thing to get to in the world. You have to lift up the dash pad. Not that bad. It's probably 10 screws or so, 15 minutes of work, and we could get to the top of this cluster. But now I can access everything. I can see the data lines from DLC going into the cluster. I can see the actual vehicle CAN where it's connected to all the modules, and I can test the powers and grounds to the cluster at the same time because I'm suspicious of the cluster at the moment. So check powers and grounds there. I have everything I need, and that's after each key cycle too. Even when the check engine light's off, when it's not starting, I have all my powers and grounds to the cluster. So that was the first thing I wanted to check for. I also scope with the U-scope both CAN buses. Number one, the the diagnostic CAN between the scan tool and the cluster. And I actually do have activity there. There is stuff going on when I'm pressing buttons on my scan tool. Now, I don't know, is that just from my scan tool trying to talk to the cluster? Is the cluster communicating on that? I don't know. But I go over to the high-speed CAN and I also see activity there. So what I decided to do here was I jumped my DLC I jumped my scan tool VCI. I took that straight to the CAN network that's connected to the ECM, the TCM, the ABS, right? So I'm bypassing the cluster to see, can I talk to everything on that CAN network? And what's interesting about CAN networks, from my experience, I'm sure there's probably an exception here, so do be careful if you're going to rely on this test method. But from my experience on a CAN network, even if it's not a CAN network that is connected to a DLC on a car, right? So in this instance, this is exactly what I mean. The CAN network that the modules communicate on is not physically connected to the DLC, but I can connect my VCI to that CAN network and I can talk to it. I can pull data. I can communicate with modules. And I've done this before if I want to bypass my gateway module and see, is this network actually functioning or not, right? And so I'm hardwired in from my scan tools VCI to the CAN network that the ECM lives on. And that, again, is my main concern. And I do a vehicle scan at that point. I could actually communicate with the cluster and all of the other modules on the high-speed CAN. Now, the exception being here, and I do want to point this out, is after that initial key cycle, I could no longer talk to my ECM. And looking back on it, this was a huge giveaway that I completely ignored in the moment. I was, I guess, excited that, hey, I can talk to everything, including my cluster. I could communicate with my cluster via the CAN network on the other side of it, if you will, right? I couldn't through the DLC, but I could when I was on the high-speed network. Now, the ECM, once I cycled that key, I couldn't talk to it again. Again, this is a giveaway. Once we get farther into the diagnosis, you'll understand why, but I had tunnel vision and I moved right past that. I was just like, okay, I can talk to everything here. This is definitely a cluster issue. And I also had my immobilizer code saying, hey, I can't talk to the ECM. And I just determined, well, this has got to be a gateway issue. Again, what are the odds our used module has this exact same issue as the old one? Pretty unlikely. I can't talk to things through the DLC. I've got a communication code in the immobilizer. I can talk to stuff when I'm on that network. It's just some sort of data transfer between the networks in the gateway. And of course, the other question arises, well, why do you get that initial start? Why can you start it that first time after a battery disconnect? And again, this is hindsight question I should have asked myself. I didn't really think that through in the moment. I told them, hey, I think there's some sort of communication issue here with the cluster. See if you can find a used one. We'll put it in there and we'll see what happens. So they do that. They get a cluster for this thing, used one, but you can do a used one on this. And other than the mileage, it's plug and play on these old Volvos. They plugged it in as the exact same issue. Nothing changed. Okay, so I'm back to square one at this problem, or at this point. We got the same problem. I need to go back in and reassess where I'm at. And it's kind of funny, again, that whole tunnel vision thing. Once you've made a bad call and you replaced a component, and most of us have done this at one point or another, where we make a bad call, we put that part in and we're like, okay, well, it can't be that. So what else can it be? Okay, well, I have to go this direction now, right? It's weird how things become more clear after you make a bad call, and you're like, well, why didn't I go this direction first? And that was definitely my feelings here. Again, tunnel vision, but I think it's important to point out where we make mistakes here and bad calls, and this is one of them for me. I made the completely wrong call, and I ignored some stuff that was staring me in the face in the moment as well. But anyways, all we can do is try again, learn, and that's what I'm going to do here. We're going to try this again. And at this point, I'm still wondering, well, why can't I talk to anything? Because it's the same thing with the used cluster that they put in there. And I come back to, okay, well, maybe this is a scan tool thing. Maybe there's another issue with the vehicle that I haven't figured out yet, but my communication issue, why I can't talk to things through the DLC, is scan tool. I tried my Autel, I tried my Top Don. Okay, I do have an iScan, which I should have been using in the first place. And next time I get one of these old European turds, that's what I'm going to be using is my iScan. Because the iScan, if you're not familiar, is geared towards European vehicles and does a really good job of it, especially with the old stuff in comparison to the other tools that I have. So I plug in my iScan. I can talk to everything on the car. All right. Now, this is after the battery disconnect, first key cycle. I can talk to everything on the car. Except when I cycle my key and I lose my check engine light, then I can't talk to the ECM, which again is what I experienced before, but I blew right past it. And now it's very clear to me, okay, there's nothing wrong with the cluster. And the reason the immobilizer has a code for the ECM is because it's offline. It's not talking after you cycle the key. So I got to go towards my ECM. That's it. Okay. And I'm now going down the same path that the shop originally did. Let's go to this ECM and do some testing. What am I missing after that first key cycle that is not allowing this ECM to power up and do anything? So if you're not familiar with these old Volvos, the ECM is in a box up the right front corner of the vehicle in front of the power steering reservoir. And the connector's on the bottom, and to get this ECM out for any testing, there's like a big lever tool that you use to slide the connector, and you can do it with screwdrivers, and that's what the shop was doing. But luckily I have the lever tool. Noah gave it to me, and it makes this so much easier if you actually have the tool to get these things in and out. But it's not easy to test at this module, but get it out, and I do some testing, and what I end up finding out is there's not much that needs to be at this module for it to be awake and communicating. There's two powers, one's constant, one's switched. There's two grounds, and there's CAN lines. And that's it. That's all this module should need to communicate, to be functional. And it is that first key cycle, but after you cycle the key, which kills power on that switched ignition circuit, then after you turn it back on, it won't talk anymore, even though power comes back on that circuit. And so everything I'm testing, which isn't much, like I say, there's not much this thing needs. It's got it. It's got power. It's got a constant power. It's got a switched power. It's got both grounds. It's got CAN communication the whole time. So what's going on here? Is it possible that I got another module with the exact same problem? And I was talking to the tech about it, and the tech had mentioned, he's like, hey, when we first bought this module, before we called you, we plugged it in. Okay, so this is a donor module, came from another vehicle. We plugged it in, and I could cycle that key as many times as I wanted, and the check engine light never turned off. Now, it didn't start, and reason being is immobilizer plus, we'll get to the module that they got came out of the vehicle with the wrong engine, but that check engine light never turned off. And that was their indicator of, hey, was this thing awake? And it's a good indicator in this case. You know, key up, you should see that check engine light bulb. And so that got me thinking, okay, well, maybe it's possible I transferred over the problem when I cloned the software. And I really hadn't even thought about that up until this point. I mean, I went through the whole diagnosis with the ECM. You know, once I made the bad call on the cluster, then I'm going for the ECM. And this whole time, I'm not even really thinking of the possibility that I could have transferred this problem over just because it's such a strange issue, right? This doesn't seem like a software problem where you get one key cycle out of a module and then nothing else after it. A hardware problem, I could definitely believe that, or something wrong with the car. I could also definitely believe that, but it doesn't appear to be that way. But okay, how do I proceed? How do I prove this out? How do I fix this, for this shop and get this vehicle functional? What I decided to do was do some testing at home with the modules on the bench, right? I want to verify that I'm not missing anything weird on the car. Like maybe there's some sort of 5-volt reference that's shorting out the module or something, something oddball that I'm not even aware of to check. And instead of going through circuit by circuit on the car, I decided I'm going to try to power this thing up on the bench. And as I power it up on the bench, I want to see, does it do the same thing as when it's in the car? And so what I did was I connected everything like it would be in the car, CAN lines, ground to the module, and 2 powers. So the one power is constant, the same terminal that has constant power in the car. And then I have one that's switched, and I'm using the Go Diag box, which allows you to actually switch specific power feeds on and off to a module. If you're doing any bench work, get one of those Go Diags. They're fantastic. So I do that. I hook my test light up in place of where the check engine light would be. So I have a visual confirmation. I also have the scan tool hooked up, and I have an amp clamp hooked up to the ground feeds to the module. So I can see, is this thing drawing amperage? Is it turning on the test light? Is it communicating with the scan tool? All this stuff I can see right on the bench. And so what I do is I simulate exactly what happens in the car. I shut everything off, all power to it, and turn it on. And initially I have CAN communication. I have a check engine light on. I'm drawing amperage. I can talk to the module. But once I switch that switched ignition feed from off to on with the Go Diag, then I lose my check engine light. I lose communication, and the module is still drawing amperage. Like electrically, it's doing something, but it will not wake up. And you can cycle that key back and forth, and you can't talk to it. So it's exactly the same as the car. Now I can eliminate everything in the car. There's nothing on that car that is causing this issue. It's in the module, okay? And based on what the tech was telling me, this most likely didn't exist with this donor module before I did the programming. Okay, well, can I prove that just to make sure that, we didn't get a second bad module? So what I did was, and this is something that I want to point out, if you're doing module cloning and you're reading these files and you're saving these bin files from these modules, make sure to not only save your original, but save your donor files as well. Save everything that you get out of a module, because there's a chance you might need it, like where I'm at right now. And so what I did was I took the donor file, because I'm working with a donor module right now, the one that came from a junkyard. And I'm now going to put its original file back in it, right? So this thing came out of the junkyard. It had a flash file in it. It was the wrong engine because the VIN number is actually on the module. And I, punched that into Identifix, and it had a different engine than the one that I'm working on. But it's got a flash file in it. It's got an EEPROM file in it. I'm going to punch those back into the module. So I do that. I program those into the module. And then I do the exact same thing that I did with the ignition switch on the bench, test light hooked up where the check engine light is, my scan tool hooked up. And now when I cycle that ignition switch, this thing stays alive. It wakes up every time that I hit that ignition switch, and it talks on the scan tool, and the check engine light is on, and the problem is gone. So what I've done here is I've proved that the issue was transferred over from the original module to the donor, right? With the donor, with its file that it came with, it doesn't have this problem. But when I put the file in from the original module, I build in this problem. This is a software issue that is causing this module to go dead after one key cycle. Now, how exactly it got corrupted in that manner, I don't know. Very, very strange. And if you would have asked me, the shop pretty much did ask me prior to seeing this, I would have said, no, I don't think that's possible. That's very unlikely. But it definitely happened, and I proved it out on the bench for sure, 100%. Now, my next thing is, okay, well, how do I fix this for the shop? Again, if I have Volvo software, the factory stuff, and I'm sure somebody out there listening can tell me, oh, you just do this, and it'll correct the software, and you can use that module. But I don't have that. And so using the tools that I have, I'm like, well, what do I do here? Okay, can I get another used module out of a vehicle with a correct engine, right? That would have the same flash file that I'm looking for, the correct one for the engine. And at that point, obviously that'll run the engine the way it's supposed to. Can I transfer over just the immobilizer data. Because from what I found, the VIN wasn't stored in this module, but the immobilizer data definitely is. It communicates with the immobilizer on the vehicle. Now, again, is there a way to do that to match up this ECM once it's in without cloning? Very possible. And again, hey, if you know how to do that, let me know. I'd be curious to know. But what I was wondering was, can I just transfer over the immobilizer data? And how would I find that? Well, Flex breaks up the files in this to Flash and then an EEPROM. Now, generally speaking, and I'm sure there are exclusions to this, but generally speaking, VIN immobilizer key data is stored within the EEPROM section of the read. The vehicle program to say, hey, you're a 2.3 liter turbo 5-cylinder, that's going to be stored in the Flash area. That's to actually run the engine and all the other features that the engine control module has to operate. It's in the Flash section, whereas, again, the immobilizer, the security, the VIN number, if there is a VIN number, is in the EEPROM section. And that's true of a lot of modules that we see, especially with engine control modules. That's how they're set up. So because that's split up into two, I'm wondering, can I just take the EEPROM section from the original and put it into a computer that has the right Flash? Now, the question would be, well, I transferred that problem over. Is it in the Flash? Is it in the EEPROM? Somehow both. I don't know. What I did here was I took my original module, right, the one that has the problem, has an issue, and I transferred over the Flash file, just the Flash file, not the EEPROM, from the donor module, right? So I'm taking the donor module's Flash and I'm putting it into the original because I know that donor didn't have the issue. I do that, and the original module now does not turn off on the bench, or it doesn't stay dead on the bench. Problem's gone. So I know the problem's in the Flash specifically, not the EEPROM. And so that gives me the confidence, okay, I'm going to go find a used one that has the right engine. I'm just going to transfer over the EEPROM from the original to our second donor, and then I'm going to plug this thing in and it should be good to go. So I do that. Go to the shop, plug it in, it's plug and play, it fires up. We cycle that key a bunch of times and it's good to go every single time. So super, super interesting that this is the way that it ended up being. And I learned a lot from it, right? Especially with these modules, what I can do with the tooling that I have. Maybe I need to research more, but how many 99 Volvos am I going to see? Probably not a ton. This is a isolated instance. And if you listen to last week's episode, you heard me and Zach talking about the hero cars, the ones that get us in the weeds. And this is kind of one of those where, it doesn't make sense to put this much effort in. The argument could be made both ways, but I will say that I learned a ton. And now, one of the big takeaways for me from this is when I'm doing my module cloning, it is possible to transfer over issues from the original module, and you got to be aware of that. There's a chance that you could build in a problem. And again, I wouldn't have guessed that this type of problem would have transferred over with software, with the Flash, but it 100% did. There's no doubt in my mind. And so now going forward, I'm going to be real cautious about this. Now, it doesn't mean I'm not going to clone modules. There's a definite time and place for that. It's part of what I offer as a service, but that's going to be in the back of my head anytime I'm cloning one over is, hey, am I transferring over any issues from the old one that is a software corruption as opposed to a hardware issue? The other big things are always save your donor files. Save all the files that you get. If you get a read on a chip or a module, save it. It's so important to have that stuff. In this case, this allowed me to prove out what I needed to know and prove that the module or the software was an issue, not necessarily the hardware of the module. So save all that stuff. Watch out for tunnel vision too. I was talking about when I went in and I called the cluster, I really, really had tunnel vision. And looking back at it, like not being able to communicate with the ECM once I was tied into the high-speed CAN should have been a giveaway. I really should have thought about using my iScan the first time I was looking at this vehicle. The check engine light, component of it all made so much sense once I got to the conclusion. But in that moment, I had tunnel vision and blew right past all that stuff. So we always got to be conscious of that as we're fixing cars. That Volvo ECM lever tool is really awesome. If you work on these old Volvos, get one. Totally worth it. And yeah, use the iScan on these old Euro cars for sure. If you don't have one, check it out. It's an awesome tool. They have the SOD, support on demand, where they can remote in and program stuff for you too. It comes with the IMS2 functions where it can double as an ICOM or a VAS, so you can be like the factory interface for some of these European vehicles. Pretty cool tool for sure. I would definitely recommend it if you're looking at a lot of European vehicles. But that's all I got for you today. I wanted to share that because I thought that was a pretty interesting one. Appreciate everybody listening. With that all out of the way, let's get out there, start fixing the world, one car at a time.